Today, we're gonna make pancakes, but not just any kind of pancakes. We're gonna make special pancakes today. And I wanna go through a whole bunch of steps with you that as you watch this video is gonna come at you really fast. You're gonna feel like it's gonna go way too fast and that you're gonna want me to slow down in a few parts. That's normal. I want you to recognize that as you go through this, we're gonna just skip through a lot of what we would consider introductory Photoshop stuff, right? In terms of layers and tools and palettes and where all these menus and things are. Because one thing that I've discovered over the years is that most people actually have a pretty good sense of what those things are and kind of what they might do. But they also get the sense pretty quick that they just kind of want to jump in, and that the best way to learn is to learn by doing. So that's what we're going to do. Before we get too far into it, however, I will for one time demo a little bit about what it is that you should be aware of that you get as a benefit with your IU account. Because as an IU student, you have the benefit of not only getting access to all of the Creative Suite for free, you also get all of Adobe fonts for free, and you get the Adobe stock photos site completely free, and all of it is unlimited, which is a huge saving. I can't even begin to explain to you how much money that would probably save you if we had to buy all these things individually. I'm old enough to remember a time when I actually still had to buy Photoshop because there was no student license at any university. And so as you go through this, recognize that we're going to go quickly. You have lots of options available to you. You have complete creative freedom in a lot of the things that we're going to do, including in this week's assignment. And I want you to push those boundaries every single week as you go through and learn a lot about Photoshop. So let's get started. First, let's look at Adobe Stock, right? And so when you come here, you get to a page that's going to look a lot like this. I went ahead and did a search for pancakes with fruit. And as you do a search, you're going to get all kinds of results. And you can come in here into this filter panel, and you can even qualify a lot of the search vectors that you're looking for. So in this case, our student license does not cover premium content. And so you can just look for standard content. That will save you the hassle of finding the photo that you always want that you can't ever get because you have to pay for it. You can modify these based off of photo type, whether or not they were done with generative or other AI tools, even the orientation and such. As you go through here, you can open up multiple tabs of these things, and you'll notice that as you go through, sometimes you'll see photos that say licensed on them, and sometimes they won't, and you'll hover over them and there'll be a button that will allow you to license them. I see a lot of students that come in here, they click on a photo that they want, and they just sort of grab it and then start dragging it off someplace onto their computer or into Photoshop. If you do that, you're not grabbing the actual file, you're grabbing the stock photo of it. And as you can see, if you zoom in on it, there is a lot of, well, I guess I can't. There we go. You can see that there's the little Adobe stock watermark on it, and that's just not great. And we don't want that in any of our photos. We don't want that in any of our work. In fact, if at any point in time this semester you turn in something that has a stock watermark on it, I'm probably going to tell you to redo that because it's not high quality work. It's not professional. Same thing with people historically will run off and get photos from Google Images, or they'll go to other photos or photo photography sites like Shutterstock. That's fine, I suppose, to some extent, for some things some of the time, but it should be exceedingly rare, particularly in this class because of the fact that you have access to Adobe Stock. A lot of times what I think that happens is that students just run in, they go to hit a Google search because they want something quick, and they just kind of pluck whatever they get. They tend to get low quality resources as a result. The files aren't very high resolution, they're not very good, they're not very interesting, and in a lot of cases it just makes for worse work. So stick with Adobe Stock, and the same with Adobe Fonts, which we'll get to at another point later on in this class. Now, as we are looking at Adobe Stock, you're going to find that it's a lot like cooking, that having all of your stuff in a nice little finder window like I have already over here is going to make your life a whole lot easier, because if you find photos that you want, you just click the license button and then it's going to prompt you to download them and save them to your computer. It's going to get this little thing where it says saving to the default library, and then after about a second or two, you're going to get an option to save the file. I find that it's extremely helpful if you run through and save assets that you need and work out of one folder. Don't make this your desktop. Don't make this into a bunch of disparate folders. Don't make a new folder each week. Just make a class photo folder for this and then label it as like week 1 and week 2 and week 3 as you go. And then just dump all the assets for that particular week in that folder. It's going to make your productivity a lot better as you go through the weeks, because you'll be able to bounce back at any point in time that you need to for revision purposes, which will happen. And you'll have all your files in one spot. It's also going to make it really easy, like combining ingredients when you're cooking, to just sort of cobble them all together really fast, because you're going to have them all in one spot. So let's get started with some of the Photoshop work. Now, when you first open Photoshop after you've downloaded it, and if you are struggling to download it, there is a help document that you can access. You just Google for it even too. Installing Creative Suite at Indiana University, and you'll find the instructions to download this. You will need to log in first using your Adobe or using your IU ID in order to access your Adobe ID, and then that will enable you to download this without cost. Again, there is no cost for any of this. If you get prompted to purchase something, you've missed a step someplace, and you should go back and consult that. As we're talking about this, when you open up Adobe Photoshop, you're going to get greeted with a window that looks a lot like this. It's going to have some recent files that you may have down there. These are some of my more recent files. And what I want to do is I've already chosen a photo that I want to work with. And so I'm just going to take it, and you can drag it onto your Photoshop icon. If you're on a Mac, you can also do this on a PC by just dragging it into the Photoshop window. It also works the same way on a Mac, where you can just drag it into the window. Now, I have this nifty little stack of pancakes right here, and it looks pretty yummy and delicious, but I want to make it a little bit more interesting. And so what am I going to do with that? Well, I've also got this picture of a snake, and I want to take my steak and plop it in there. Now, you'll notice that when I did that, all I did was just click on it, drag it, and plop it over there. When I do that, you get this nice little selection with the little grab handles. And you'll notice too that it will size proportionally, no matter which one that you've got. You can also rotate these things as you go. And it won't let you do a whole lot else until you commit this. In Photoshop, this is called placing a file. And so in this case, I want my snake to kind of sit someplace about like this. And I'm going to size him a little bit down. And I'm going to hit enter. Okay. So now that I've got my snake in here and I've got my pancakes, I need to start to get rid of the parts of the snake that I don't want in this case. And so to do that, you'll notice that over here on the right-hand side of your Photoshop window is that you have a thing that's called the Layers panel. And this is going to be probably the most important panel that you work with throughout the entire semester, because it's going to show you how these layers work. And it works about like how you think. If you take layers and you say, add a new one here, for example, it's on top of the snake, which is itself on top of the background. The background by default is whatever opens with the document. You'll notice too, the background is got a little lock icon. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. If you want to unlock it so that way you can do something with it, all you have to do is just click on it once and it goes away. But then you can sort of rearrange, right? So you can grab different layers and move them around. And so you can even hide them by clicking on the little eye icon, and you'll see that the stack of layers is modified based off of where. Let's continue by getting rid of parts of the snake that we don't want. And in this case, I don't want most of the snake's body, and I don't really actually want any of the snake's skin. What I want is kind of the inside of the mouth. Now, Photoshop has this new tool in here that as you have an asset like this, it's going to put this little menu bar down here. This is new as of about a few months ago. And if you click on select subject, it does a pretty okay job, right? Like it grabbed most of that snake's head, and that's pretty good. But I don't actually want all of the rest of the green part of the snake, and I don't really want the eyes necessarily either. I think I just want the inside of the mouth. But this is pretty good. So I'm just going to I'm going to run with this and then continue to get rid of the parts that I don't want. And to do that, I'm going to hold Command J. And you'll notice that as it did that, it got rid of the little selection that it had around my snake. It had the little marching ants, and it has created seemingly nothing. But if you'll notice over here in my layers panel, that if I hide the initial snake layer, that I now have my little snake's head. Now, the select subject option that is here works pretty well. It's powered by a lot of Photoshop's new AI tools, and it does a good job on images like our snake image, where it's pretty apparent that the background is blurry, right? It does not work so well when you've got lots of things that are all in focus. It works pretty poorly sometimes when you've got a bunch of people in a line, for example. But in this case, it worked pretty well. And so you'll make yourself a lot happier if you select stock images that have pretty clean backgrounds as a result. So I'm going to hide my original snake layer. I'm going to turn on my new snake layer that it has labeled layer 1. As good practice, you can double click on all of these and type in there and hit enter, and you can rename the layers. Okay. This is good practice. It's also the sort of thing that hardly nobody does. It's one of those good intentions that we'd all like to do, but we don't really ever do. So now that we've got our snake head in here, I'm going to hit the E key on my keyboard, and it's going to bring up the eraser. That's going to automatically select the eraser tool over here in my tools panel. This over here on the left-hand side is where all of Photoshop's primary mouse tools are. These include brushes and selection tools, and we'll be exploring a lot of these different ones throughout the semester. For right now, we're going to go with the eraser tool, which is about halfway down here in the Photoshop menu. And I can just click and start to drag, and it will do exactly what you think it does, which is that it will erase. Now, I'm going to undo this real quick for demonstration purposes. Command Z, Control Z on Windows. The eraser has properties, and the properties can be configured up here at the top. And so when you click up here, you'll see that you get options for the size and the hardness. And so if I have a brush that's at 100% hardness, and I come in here and I click, it's got a very clean line to it, right? But if I come down here and I make the hardness 0%, and I do the same thing, you'll notice that it's much softer. And so in both of these cases, those have some value, but for my purposes today, I want a very soft brush, which means 0 hardness or very nearly 0 hardness. Now, modifying the size up here can be a little cumbersome. A faster shortcut is to just use the keyboard. If you use the left and right brackets, and the left and right bracket are these keys right here. These are the ones that are usually just above the return key on most keyboards, and they will enable you to quickly size up and down the brush. And so if I've got the left bracket, it gets smaller, and if I hit the right bracket, or if I just hold it, it gets bigger. In my case, I want something kind of about like that. And I am just going to run through here, and I'm going to erase all the parts of the snake's mouth that I don't want. There. Now I've got my snake mouth, and I've removed all of the parts of the snake that I don't want. But it doesn't look very good, does it? It looks sort of like I've just kind of plopped it on there, doesn't it? And so in this case, what can I do? It's like, well, there are some options here. And so one of the things that I want to do is I want to make both the pancakes look more realistic, as if they've got kind of a bulge there. And I also want to make the snake's color match the pancakes. And so how are we going to do that? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the background, because I want to start with the pancakes first. And I want to use the liquify tool. And as a helpful guide for when you start looking for tools and you don't know where they are, you can come up to the help menu. And if you type in options, at least on a Mac anyway, it will give you the option to see where these different options live in the menus. And so in this case, it's a filter. It's the filter liquify. And if I come in here and click on liquify, with my pancake layer had been selected, it gives me this big preview of the image with some options over here. And to be perfectly honest, I think I'm just going to look at these options by the default where they currently are. My left and right bracket will continue to resize the size of my brush here. And what I want, and it's going to be a little challenging because of the fact that I don't see the snake that I've also got in there. But you can also click on this show backdrop if that's the case. I want to just sort of pluck up by clicking and dragging a little bit where my snake mouth was. And I also want to bring it in a little bit here. And so I'm just clicking and sort of pulling. This liquefy tool, by the way, is the same tool that's commonly used in magazine photos of supermodels because it's really useful at sort of thinning people, and it works pretty well. So now I've got this little bulge here, about like that. So I'm going to uncheck the show backdrop. Now this looks pretty bad right here because Photoshop has used some algorithms to sort of push this stuff around, but we're going to hide behind this with putting our snake there, so it's going to be okay. So I'm going to hit confirm changes down here. I got to move my little preview out of the way though. Okay, there we go. And so now I've got this little bit of a bulge. And so now I'm going to come back with my move tool. This is the V key on the keyboard, and select my snake mouth. And I'm going to kind of move it into a little bit different of a position here. I'm even going to size it up a little bit so that it kind of matches where my bulge was and sort of where my inner points came to be on that. And something about like that. Now, the next thing that I need to do is I need to make sure that I get my snake mouth to match the color. And so one of the things that we're going to do a lot in this course, and it's always one of the first things that I go to, is whenever I want to make sure that something is blended with something else, there's a thing called the blending mode, and it's right here in your layers panel. So with the snake mouth selected, by default, all layers start off as normal, and you can always change them back to normal. But as you hover through these, you'll notice that Photoshop does some pretty interesting trickery with the lighting. And you'll also notice too that sometimes, in this case, that it gets a little bit of a graphics bug where it does not do it to all of the layer, but it gets us close here. And so I'm looking through here, and what I want to see is which one of these looks like it's algorithmically changing the blacks, whites, and grays in a way that makes this work well. Hard light is interesting, right? And so, you know, there's soft light, that's almost invisible. Hard light, interesting. Coming down here, I think I got a good idea that which one I'm going to want, which is actually down here. The last one, luminosity. So if I click on luminosity, that does a lot of work for us, doesn't it? Suddenly, the color matching is much better in this circumstance. But we can do a little bit better. The luminosity has done a lot of effort here to make this better, but if you go to Image Adjustments, Match Color, you get a little menu item here, and at first it doesn't look like it's going to do a whole lot, but you need to make sure that it has a source. And so for our case, we want this is the layer, or this is the file name that I'm working with, pancakes.jpg, and I want it to sample the background. And when I do that, it's automatically going to look at the background of this image and say, okay, well, I see lots of like browns, and I see lots of like, light cream colors. I see lots of neutral colors up here. And so it's going to try and match all that together. And you can play around with some of the settings in here to see how dragging these sliders around is going to work. About like that. Good. So now that I have this in here, the next thing that I want to do is I want to continue to soften up my edges, right? And so I've got these hard points that are located around here that I need to make a little bit cleaner. And so you can see them better if you hold the Option or Alt key on a PC and just scroll with your mouse wheel. You can also, if you're using a trackpad, pinch the trackpad just as you would expect. And so you can just kind of lightly brush around the edges here. Now that I've done that, now what? So wouldn't it be great if there was a little bit of honey or syrup that was dripping off of this fang? It's like, well, I could potentially grab it from something else in this image, but in this case, I actually need another stock photo. And so I found one earlier that looks like this. I had rejected using this image as our default image because I thought it was kind of boring in the background. But if I just plop it in here, you'll notice that it's got this really nice bit of long syrup that's dripping down off of there. And so if I grab my move tool and I just sort of put it off to the side here, you'll notice that when I dragged it in here, I have a whole new layer. I have my snake mouth layer. I have my original snake layer, which I'm not really using. And then I have my background layer. And so what I want to do is I want to create a new layer between these two layers. To do that, I'm just going to click on one. It doesn't really matter which. And I'm going to click on New Layer. It's the little option down here, right next to the Delete Layer button, Create New Layer. Once I create a new layer, it's going to be empty and you're not going to see anything on it. Photoshop will always create the layer on top of whatever the layer was that you had selected. So if you were up here, just drag it down, plop it between the pancakes that you just plopped in and the snake mouth. In this circumstance, what I want to do is I want to use the rubber stamp tool. If I hit S on the keyboard, it'll select it for me. It's this one right over here. It looks like a little stamp. Now, the way this works is the rubber stamp tool wants me to select a source layer. And to do that, I'm going to click on the layer that has what I want to copy. And I'm going to hold the Option key. And I'm going to click right there at a point on this image. And then I'm going to come back to my layer 1. And you'll notice that my mouse cursor now has what looks like a beige dot. But if I were to start painting, you'll notice that it's duplicating all of the stuff that's off to the left. Now, I don't need all of that. I just need part of that. And so from here, again, I'm going to hold Option, pick my start point, come back to layer 1, and I'm going to come from right about here, and I'm going to drag down. Something about like that. Maybe something that goes down like that. There we go. So that in and of itself does not look that great, right? But part of that is because we didn't match some of the color. And so for this, I'm going to hit the V tool, or move, V key, and I'm going to hide my layer with my pancakes and the honey. I don't need that anymore at this point. And I'm going to double click this layer and I'm going to call it honey. And as I come in here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I want to get nice and close in on this. And as I'm in here, I want to, again, sort of soften up the edges a little bit, particularly around here at the top. And I'm also going to check and see if maybe making my color blend mode luminosity helps too. And it does. It does make that a little bit different, doesn't it? Now, one last thing that's in here as we start looking at this, you'll notice that I've got some gray banding in here. This gray is a result of the luminosity layer that's in here. If I change this, you'll see that it mostly goes away. And so how do I get rid of that? Because I don't really want that. And I've got this in kind of two or three very obvious places. Well, one thing that I can try is I can duplicate this layer and then start to get kind of visually trickery with it too. So I'm going to hit, with this layer selected, the snake mouth, Command J. It's going to duplicate that layer. I want to bring this one down, and I want to change the luminosity on it to just normal. But that pretty much brings us back to where we started, right? And so I don't really want that, but I can reduce this opacity right here by clicking on the word opacity, or I can click here and I can drag down various options. Something about like that. Now, what I want is to do this to the point that the bands go away. Once I'm there, I can erase. I can erase parts of this that I don't want. But sometimes you can actually literally get away with just sort of painting a solid color in Photoshop to get some result that you want. And so as we continue to work on this snake mouth, you'll notice that we've still got some of this banding here even after trying to sort of finagle it with some of the duplication of it. And so in this case, what I want to do is I'm just going to make a new layer on top of this one. and I'm going to hit the I key. That's the letter I. And it's going to bring up an eyedropper tool. And as I do this, if I click and hold, you'll notice that up in the top right and also in the far left, if you notice that the little color square is changing based off of whatever color is currently there. And so if I just come down here and I pick a color that's kind of, pancakey like that, then I can grab the brush tool, which is the letter B. It's this tool right over here. And if I size up my brush a little bit with this layer, I can come in here and I can just sort of paint. That eliminates a lot of our banding. Now, I can play around with this by sort of maybe dragging it underneath, but you'll notice that it hides the little banding situation that we've got. So I think I kind of like it underneath both of these layers. I might even reduce the opacity just a little bit. And to sort of soften this up, I'm going to paint some in here. And then I'm going to grab the eraser tool, and I'm just going to touch up around the edges there. So that way it blends in a little bit more. I like that. That's pretty good. Follow along here and I'll show you how you can save this file. And so once you have this, I'm going to go File, Save As. You're going to give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call mine pancakes.psd. That's Photoshop document. You're going to make sure this is in Photoshop format. Okay. Everything else can stay just the same. If you get to this menu, great. A lot of you may not. And so Photoshop prompts me, at least at the most random intervals. You may see a black window that says Save to Adobe Cloud. In that case, there'll be a button that's someplace down in the bottom left-hand corner that says Save to Computer instead, or Save to Disk. And in those circumstances, just click the button, and then you'll be greeted with your typical Save As dialog. Once you've saved that file, that's pretty good. But you'll notice that the problem is we've got a 5,000 by 3,500 pixel 300 dpi image here. I don't really need all of that to submit into Canvas. That'd actually kind of make it sad. And so what I want you to get in the habit of, unless otherwise explicitly said in the assignment, is get into the habit of adjusting the size of these things. So if you go to image size, you'll notice that it starts off here for me anyway in inches, but it might be for pixels or some other measurement. But in this case, we're going to look at pixels. Pixels are just a dot on the screen, and so I can show you an individual pixel. If you zoom way in on any one of these images, you'll find that each one of these little squares is a pixel, and that as you zoom out, it makes the complete whole. We don't need quite this many in here, so go to image size, set them to pixels, and as a general rule, pick whichever one of these numbers is longer. In this case, 5,000 is bigger than 3,000. And also note that the resolution is set to 300. 300 is for print quality stuff. In this case, we do not need to intend to print this. We're not going to send it to a commercial printer. It's not like a brochure or something like that. And so screen images can pop in at 72 resolution. And you'll notice that this automatically changes our width and our height to something a little bit better. As a general rule, whatever the longest or largest number is, the longest side, squash it down to 2,000 pixels. Now, here's the thing. It's important that you do the DPI, the resolution first, because if I come in here and I say, okay, 2,000, and then I make this 72, now I have a 480 pixel wide image, which is teeny. And so I don't want that, because then you got to come back up here and you got to resize it back up anyway. So in this case, just automatically set the resolution first, and then never have a width that's any larger than 2,000 there. And so as a practical quality, it's still pretty big. In fact, this is at 100% right about here, and it still looks perfectly fine, right? So in this case, now I can save it, Command S, or you can do File Save. And then the last thing that we're going to do is we need to export a JPEG version of this. So go to File, Export, Export As. It's going to bring up this export menu. I'm going to change the format to JPEG. And the quality can usually stay as either 6 or 7. 6 is fine for our purposes here. And then I'm going to hit, whoops, it's going crazy up there. Let go. And then I'm going to hit export. It's going to ask me again to save this, and I'm going to call it the same thing that I called my PSD. I want all of you to submit with your last name, a dash, and the week number. And you're going to find this super helpful as time goes on if we need to come back to revise any assignments. So in that case, it would look something like Harder-Week01. Hit save, and we're set. And from here, I can upload these files into Canvas because now I have a handy dandy JPEG version with my snake.